We come to the fifth presentation in a set of 13. It's not a series because we're not depending upon a linearity for comprehension. We're grouping, and we're grouping in such a way that it has a scalar, and that scalar is capable of being a harmonic, which can both be aesthetically appreciated and scientifically analyzed. Our excursion is one which is classic and radical also at the same time. We have for quite some while been faced by classic radical conundrums that in the past of our planet's heritage were responded to rather than answered in very high Dharma ways. Here in the 21st century, we are right at the cusp of being able to contribute our high Dharma response to classic radical quandaries. In the heritage, right up until this time, the quandary was always between 0 and 1. What is new for us is that we have paired with that classic radical quandary another binary, which is infinity and 0. And this has a prelude of 1 and infinity. And this has been a problem now, conspicuously, for 3 full generations. We're into the 4th generation. Classically, the challenge requiring a response only lasts 3 or 4 generations, so this generation must do it. It's not that it hasn't been addressed in great genius, but that the actual situation is literally unheard of previously. And the classic radical response of understanding 0, which was sufficient before, no longer is able to fulfill the other requirement, that it be not only sufficient but necessary. We must be able to work infinity and 0 as a symmetry, as a pair, into our phenomenal excursion in nature and into another ecology which has become so apparent to us, and that is the ecology of consciousness. The colloquial understanding traditionally was that there is consciousness as a space of purity of the mind, that the structures of thought are capable of engendering another kind of a space, another kind of a context. And this was sufficient in the classic planetary past, no longer able to withstand the real challenge before us. This is a presentational set, a grouping that begins with a quintessential dimension called consciousness, in that dimension is not only another dimension like time or the 3 dimensions of space, but is truly quintessential. And that term is an alchemical term. It means, like the hand, if you have four-dimensional fingers and you add a quintessential fifth, it's like adding a thumb to the hand, and prehensile capacities that were not there before become refinable as well as immediately utilitarian. With fingers you can grasp, you can do certain aspects, but with a thumb, a full hand. Now you have an interesting situation, because with two hands, with two thumbed, now the pair of fives as a 10 becomes not only complete, but it becomes also capable of a perfection. In our time, about 10, 12 years ago, one of the great physicists of the 20th century wrote this little book, At Home in the Universe, John A. Wheeler. Wheeler, I think, is still alive. He's approaching 100 years old. He was famous as the great mentor for Richard Feynman at Princeton, when Feynman, as a very New Yorker young man, refusing to pay any attention to people who were teaching by rote, found in Wheeler someone who could listen as fine as Feynman could grind, increasingly in his mathematical advance. Wheeler himself learned, because he was very close to Niels Bohr and the Copenhagen School when it developed in the late 20s, in the 1930s, and from the 1930s to the mid-1950s, he was a constant friend of Einstein at Princeton at the Institute of Advanced Study. Here's a quote from page 53 of the collection of interesting writings by Wheeler. It's a question. It's a quandary. It's a quantum puzzle which, when unanswered, is a knot. When answered, it becomes a cycle requiring of a response of an ecology, so that we have a series of transforms that are necessary. Here's the quotation, the question. What do we know about the behavior of matter at densities above nuclear density that lets us say that there is not some further stopping point on the way in toward complete collapse? It was Wheeler who named black holes black holes. Not much, but this much. There is an upper limit to the rigidity of matter. The higher the rigidity of matter, the greater the speed of sound. The maximum rigidity gives a speed of sound equal to the speed of light. Those who have ears to hear can hear with both ears. The challenge requiring a response is not just a question requiring an answer. That would be a simple transform. The challenge requiring a response means that there must be a distillation of the previous transform, so that this second transform introduces a third reality. Now, in ancient times, in ancient Egypt, one would find something like this in the ancient Egyptian esoterica. we've become acquainted with the question that comes up in Genesis about the Garden of Eden and the two trees. There's a tree of life and there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Adam and Eve, sampling the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, before they could get to the tree of life, were exiled, were sent out on a kind of a journey that if they were unable to escape the time-space consequences of dividing into good and evil, they would not be able to achieve the tree of life. This is the tree of life. In ancient Egyptian, it's pronounced Persea, the Persea tree. Each leaf of this tree has a name, and if your name is inscribed on a leaf of the tree of life, you belong to eternity. But the name is inscribed 3 times in concert, so that there is a triple, a thrice greatest operation that is happening. Not just that your name is inscribable, that in itself becomes, as we shall just talk about in a few minutes, a way of making the mind available to a transparency. The second writing of the name is actually on the level of a signature that you are able not only to have your name written and you can read it, and that you can also write it, but that you can sign it. And the third is that quality of personal literacy has an eternal registry, in the sense that in reality you were never not able personally to do this. The quality that comes through for Wheeler at home in the universe was put at the very front of the book, where he put together his own little septet of muses. And there are 7 of these muses, and they make a set, a 7-part set, that is essential for the response to the very crucial challenges in their complexity that we have. And the first of the 7 Sibyls illustrates it's Intrepidia. And Intrepidia is she who encourages us that the unknown is knowable. We must be intrepid to continue, and this cues in the second Sibyl. She presents that advance by trial and error is the way in which we do our step, our dance, to have the unknown knowable. We advance by error more than we advance by immediate answers. Third, measurement and theory are inseparable. And this brings us to the spiral-like ecology of the 4 conscious dimensions. Vision, the Greek name for it, meaning contemplation, was theoria, out of which we do get theory. And theoria, always as a field, emerges a person who is able to do the envisioning. It's like a field that now helps to generate a new kind of a form, not a form of integral summation like a symbolic structure, not a form of existence like a phenomenality, but a form which is prismatic, capable of focusing a radiance in such a way that it goes back out like an hourglass. And when it goes back out like an hourglass, out of this prismatic focus, one gets the full spectrum. Now one not only has the light of vision, but one has the kaleidoscopic spectrum of a new quality of experience that was not there before. And that new quality can be said to be experiment. But experiment has a subgroup implication. Experiment is a subgroup of another dimension, like visionary consciousness is a dimension. The kaleidoscopic dimension, of which experiment is a subgroup, is historical consciousness. History expands experience through experiment and allows for science to emerge as another dimension which gives us a very interesting kind of a symmetry. And because it is not just a symmetry in nature, one of the nicest ways to talk about it is that it's a supersymmetry. And a supersymmetry has the capacity to disclose for the first time that there is a complementarity between the cycle of nature and the ecology of consciousness. So that complementarity is not an idea in a symbolic structure. It can be, for discussion purposes, symbolically, but the complementarity is higher and deeper. And so the mind has to be refined. Its symbolic structure has to be now put into a position of being refinable in an analytic capacity that was not immediately necessary before and now becomes inescapable. Let me do a 5-minute related digression here. When programming capacity of computers was first achieving a very high level of refinability was almost 35 years ago, by the mid-1970s. The great genius in computer programming in the world at that time was Dutch. His name was Edgar Dijkstra. And Prentice Hall in Engelwood's Cliff, New Jersey, published a discipline of programming. And what's interesting is that in the table of contents for discipline of programming, he does not start with the first chapter, he starts with chapter 0. Executional abstraction. If you start in the cardinality, you will always be in the limitations of an arithmetic. When you add an ordinality of a zero-ness, you now move from an arithmetic to a mathematic. Later on, after more than 200 pages, Dijkstra has a paragraph with an italics title, Sad Remark. And he said this 35 years ago. We have witnessed the proliferation of Baroque, ill-defined, and therefore unstable software systems. Instead of working with a formal tool which their task requires, many programmers now live in a limbo of folklore, in a vague and slippery world in which they are never quite sure what the system will do to their programs. Wonderful programs, but what will the system do in the interaction? Under such regretful circumstances, the whole notion of a correct program, let alone a program that has been proved to be correct, becomes void. What the proliferation of such systems has done to the morale of the computing community is more than I can describe. That was in 1975. We have since then moved into trillions of operations per second. Petabytes. Coming back to the septet of Sybils, not only is the unknown knowable, not only do we advance more by error, trial and error, and measurement and theory are inseparable, but analogy gives insight. And the analogy giving insight is a mathematic of correspondence. A mythic correspondence is a correspondence between phenomenality and mentality. This is how identifications are made. This is how an identity is secured to be certain. And only under extraordinary circumstances, which seem to arise like snow in a snowstorm, is that certainty not only challenged but obviated. The correspondence in a mathematic has a very interesting background to it, and one of the beautiful ways in which that was initially brought forth was by a Swede named Sophus Lie. And it's not that there are lies, but there are Lie algebras which introduce a correspondence that makes it possible. The theory of Lie algebras is an outgrowth of the Lie theory of continuous groups. In other words, not only are there groups and groupings, but there is such a not a phenomenon, but a mathematic of continuous groups. Eventually, the great genius at the time of Bohr and Einstein, when they were tussling with quantum theory and relativity, the great mathematician then who worked with the theory of groups and raised it almost to a high Dharma level was Hermann Weyl, W-E-Y-L. Very elegant man. Wheeler, in writing of Hermann Weyl, pointed out that sometimes there's just an elegant gentleman who's the smartest guy in the room. It's too bad, but he's not only wonderful to look at and beautiful to listen to, but he knows what he's talking about better than anyone else. Weyl's great theory of groups came out in 1928. And it was one of the qualities where you had mathematicians like Paul Dirac and Hermann Weyl, who were able, like Schrödinger or Heisenberg in more popular understanding, to make fruitful the capacity to theorize further than the symbolic structures of thought had gone for a very long time. In fact, we can trace back, those of us who are acquainted with planetary heritage, we can trace it back to a time in the late 700s, early 800s, where for the very first time on this planet, the development of calculus occurred. The infinitesimal calculus of an integral and the differential calculus. But it was not applied. It was used as a meditation tool in Taoist Mahayana monasteries. The quality at the time that was there was spearheaded in India by a poet saint named Shantideva. In Japan, it was a genius named Kukai, honorifically later called Kobodaishi. Great insight. And that's India and Japan. And in China, at the apex of the greatness of the Tang Dynasty, one had a series of geniuses clustered all together in the early 700s. You had two of the greatest poets, Li Po and Tu Fu, with Wang Wei not very far behind, but you had also the beginnings of Zen, which was the interface of the Tao become a tradition and the Mahayana refining itself to a way in which it tapped a resource at its very inception some 700 years before, and obviated a knot that had been tied about midway between 0 AD and 700 means about 350 AD, and the knot that was tied at the time was tied by the founder of the Yogacara system, Asanga. He and his one of his younger brothers, Vasubandhu, developed the Yogacara, which it took a couple of hundred years for the refinement of the distillation of the ecology of consciousness to understand that this was a brilliant mentality. It was not consciousness, though its stylization was consciousness only, and that is the kicker in the works. It's now called Buddhist Idealism. It's an ism. The mind, when it functions as a mirror, not as a prism, reflects back the imagery that conception perceives. And you do not have the mirrorless openness that allows for the instantaneousness of consciousness to participate in time-space in such a way that those dimensions now act as a expandable matrix. And because that matrix is not only expandable, the transforms are refinable indefinitely. One can move now, not only carrying one's zero-ness with you with all the onenesses that there are, but now the infinities that also occur along with the zeros in the interstices of all the ones, all of the integrals, which we need because were there not zeros in between the ones, there would be no quanta. They are quantized because the zeros are constantly there in such a way that the oneness is not a static achievement, but is a vibrational iteration. It's called energy, which has a frequency. It isn't all some asymptotic peak that never stops. One. And that polarity of energy within the field of a dynamic is something that mysteriously occurs as soon as there's a division. The arbitrariness of the division is inconsequential compared to the developing quandary that occurs. Because as soon as the first division occurs, that first division now divides the zero into a one that has a polarity. And that polarity initially seems to occur as a chirality, a left and a right, magnetic. This is the beginning of the geometry of knots. This little monograph on the geometry and physics of knots is by Michael Attea, who at the University of Cambridge, he's of Arabic English descent, masterful. He's the one who was the moderator of the great debate between Stephen Hawking and Roger Penrose at Cambridge in 1994. And this, usually you don't see this. This was almost $500 for 3 little VHS cassettes. The book is out, and you can get copies of the book in paperback now, The Nature of Space and Time. And Sir Michael, just a few words from the foreword. The debate between Roger Penrose and Stephen Hawking, recorded in this book and these tapes, was the high point of a 6-month program held in 1994 at the Isaac Newton Institute for Mathematical Sciences at the University of Cambridge. It represents a serious discussion of some of the most fundamental ideas about the nature of the universe. Needless to say, we are not yet at the end of the road. Uncertainties and controversy still persist, and there's plenty to argue about. And he goes on with this, saying, this, after 60 years, is a sophisticated continuation of the Bohr-Einstein controversies of the 20s, 30s, and into the 40s. Sir Michael Attea, by the way, is the first one to do a great monograph. Princeton published it about 20 years ago, The Geometry and Dynamics of Magnetic Monopoles. A monopole can have its complement anywhere in the cosmos. But that complement need not be phenomenal in the cosmos. It can be in the conscious dimensions of a Newman. Many people use the made-up word noumenon, as if it were a pair different from phenomenon. There is no such thing as a noumenon. The Latin word is quite specific, in the Greek, quite specific. Noumen are not distinguishable by phenomenality. Phenomenality is complex enough. In fact, one can go to recent textbooks on the theory and phenomenology of sparticles, spin particles. Their polarity is not largely of charge, but of spin. And if you get interested, the great archetypal The Story of Spin by Tominaga, published by the University of Chicago Press. Tominaga was a good, close friend of Richard Feynman. Let's come back to the way in which the quandary classically formed itself with Asanga, and the way in which the solution was really a solution. If you try to answer a mental question quandary, you will never have the solution. It will not occur because it cannot occur. And the reason why it cannot occur is because you're dealing with a knot. This is why no progress is made whatsoever, and why you need a, quote, high magic, you need a magician to be able to disclose to you that you've been deceiving yourself. This was a little something from Science News, the knot of knots, the no-no of knots. And this is a number of years ago. Better ways to tell a tangled circle from a knotted loop. Magicians are experts at tying knots that look intractable, yet unravel on command. Befuddled spectators find it difficult to distinguish between such phony tangles and truly knotted ropes. Mathematicians also tussle with knots, but their task has an additional constraint. Unlike a knotted piece of rope, a mathematical knot has no free ends. In this context, a knot is a one-dimensional curve that winds through itself in three-dimensional space, finally catching its tail to form a closed loop. You can untie a shoelace and untangle a fishing line, but you can't get rid of the knot in a mathematican's loop without cutting the strand. So faced with that, the response classically, as if it were radical all over again, is to cut the knot with a division that now introduces a polarity that is indistinguishable from what seems to be an expansion of mentality into consciousness. Whereas it's simply a Baroque embellishment of a limitation. You get a Hindu temple effect by adding more and more mythological distinctions. One only increases the number of statues around the temple, so that finally the entire structure is embellished, and the only way to leave that is to walk out of the temple. The classic solution offered that was finally seen in the late 700s, 800s in Asia went all the way back to a genius named Nagarjuna, who's famous for coming to understand that zero does not occur equally with one that does occur, and that instead of dividing them, there is a middle way. You call it a madhyamika. There is a middle way that synergizes by distribution so that the ones and zeros distribute, and one gets what we know in computer parlance as a binary, which we can iterate enough times to give us all of the phenomenality that appearance needs to experiment with, provided that we can actually, in our lives, utilize that as tooled experiments, and we ourselves really add the dimensions of the ecology of consciousness to the dimensions of space-time, and participate now in a 9-dimensional complementarity, which has a great surprising virtue. A hyperspace of 10 dimensions occurs spontaneously out of that, and occurs in such a way that it is fertile to generate an 11-dimensional field process that functions as a zero field of nature. Instead of getting a cycle, or even a cycle with an ecology, one gets an infinity that can function in any kind of mental, logical structure, either as zero or as infinity. it becomes not only ambidextrous, but it becomes a way of classically, radically praying in just the right way that the cosmos not only responds, but gifts us with continuance in fertility and creativity. Let's take a little break. Let's come back. We're looking at a grouping of 13 presentations. This is the fifth, which constitute a set that establishes a scalar that's capable of a triple harmonic. It is capable of tuning the natural cycle. It's capable of recalibrating and tuning the prismatic person, and capable of tuning both those to the cosmos in such a way that they play together as a real group. Fantastic music called complementarity. We're looking at John A. Wheeler's 7 quantum symbols. And the fifth symbol is new truth connects with old truth. And one of the themes that I've dealt with for the last nearly half a century on the university level is to be able to reach back at the same time as reaching forward. And that this coordination actually turns out to be a supersymmetry. Because the parenthetical quality of existentiality allows it to expand or concentrate and neither diminish nor to explode the parentheticality of it. And to preserve that takes a carefulness of language. And the relationship of language to mind is that membrane, is that gateway, is that transparency, is finally that openness of continuity. One of the oldest truths is that our species was capable about 50,000 years ago of a refinement that was major. Homo sapiens had been around for 150,000 years. Fairly successful, but really not more so than other hominid species. Homo erectus 2 million years ago was physiologically adept at being hunters that were unmatched in history. The average Homo erectus man was nearly 6 feet tall, and they were able as a species to move out of Africa and colonize almost all of Asia, so that one finds Homo erectus in China and India, as well as Africa, 2 million years ago. But our species refined about 50,000 years ago, and Homo sapiens became Homo sapiens sapiens. The only way to say it properly was to repeat the sapiens, to give it sapiens squared. Sapiens means wise, sapientiae. We became wise about being wise, and the way that this happened is that we developed art. One finds Paleolithic cave art, the paintings the sculptor, for the very first time, the evidence is there. Not that other hominid species like Homo neanderthal were also not wise in a way, but they were unable to use language in a way which is characteristic of us. The brain size of Homo neanderthal was larger than ours. It isn't brain capacity, so many cc's. But their neuronal network in the thoracic region was primitive compared to ours in a neurological sense. And that thoracic region refined the breath so that one could have a neurological brain control of breath more than 60 times per second, which allows us to use language not just as a signal of grunts and syllables, but to be able to adjust breath to speak like I'm speaking. But it took a while not only to learn then to utilize that and to speak, but also to develop the ear to hear. By the way, if you look at the structure of the ear, the hearing part of it has a spiral bone in it that allows for not only the recirculation, but allows for the refinement of sound to be able to be modulated better and better and better. One learns to hear better and better. That is filtered if you limit yourself to just a more refined version of grunts and syllables arranged in some kind of a logical structure, even though that can be done, and one calls that rhetorical. But to play with language is not a rhetoric, it's a poetic. And it is the poetic of language that makes all the difference. One of the sweet little books to come out in the early 70s was, this was discarded from the California Lutheran College Library. I found it on the net years ago. Quantum Physics and Ordinary Language. Bergstein says in his preface, this book deals with the interdependence of the phenomenological and conceptual levels of experience. This interdependence is most objectively demonstrated by the complementarity of quantum physics. When examining the basic function of ordinary language within quantum physics, it is seen that complementarity is fundamental to human comprehension itself, particularly to the interaction of language and mind. We do not find a discursive Homo sapiens sapiens written language before about 4,400 years ago, when all of a sudden, though the capacity must have been there for 500-600 years at the time, most certainly must have been there, but all of a sudden, a written, discursive, poetic language flames into occurrence. For the first time in Egypt, you find pyramids that have hieroglyphs inside the pyramids. The first pyramid that has is the Pyramid of Venice, sometimes in older Egyptology called Unas. Venice is the correct pronunciation. So that entering that pyramid, this is late 5th dynasty, was at the end of the 5th dynasty. Entering that pyramid, the hieroglyphic language escorts and accompanies you through the entirety of the interior of the pyramid. extraordinary as the Great Pyramids are, there are no hieroglyphs in there. The Pyramid of Venice has an inner tapestry of language. So that the whole geometric prism now of a written language that can be read. And within a very short time, within about 400 years, you find what we would colloquially call quantum jumps in the poetic. The world's first identifiable, nameable, knowable author was a woman named Enheduanna. You can look her up on the net. There are websites on her. Her father was Sargon the Great, Sargon of Akkad, the first king of kings. North Semitic language man who was a millennial forerunner to Moses. And like Moses, he was put into a little bitumened basket, set adrift on the Euphrates River, and was picked up by what is referred to in the old literature as the gardener. Actually, he was the master of the royal date palm gardens, which was like a very huge thing. He rescued this little baby from the basket floating on the river, just like Moses is discovered from his basket floating on the river. And Marc Chagall, one time, in his Hasidic genius, did a beautiful lithograph of the baby Moses, and he wasn't like just curled up, but he was like Da Vinci's cosmological man as a baby. And there are times when the startling aspect of a baby is that they're really complete. I was an instant father at 34, adopted a Blackfoot Indian baby in Canada. And one time the babysitter didn't show up, and I had to take the bassinet in the back of the car to go and give my lecture at the university. And I suddenly, for some reason, made some strange sound, and I heard a chuckle from the bassinet. I thought, why didn't they tell me babies are really sentient already? So right away I started, when I go into samadhis, lay her on my chest and make sure that she got used to all of this stuff, and then talked, right? After Enheduanna, within about 200 years, a universal genius arose. His name was Zarathustra. And Zarathustra, about 4,000 years ago, put together a grouping of extended poems that were grouped together in yasnas, and the yasnas grouped together to make a prismatic way of understanding the dimensions of consciousness, from vision into spiritual person, into the historical energies kaleidoscopically, which related you to the cosmos. It was the first time that there was a way in which that language, and I made a translation. It took about 10 years to make a translation from the ancient Avestic, the Gathas of Zarathustra, and here's just a little sampling. This is from 4,000 years ago. By deed, by word, by yasna to immortality and truth given to all, Mazda, in strength of perfection, are those facets of Uhura primordially given to us. Mazda is like the radiance, not just the radiance of the sun, but the radiance of the light behind the sun. It has a feminine tone. Ahura is the ancient Avestic word which means Lord. The understanding is whatever horizons, there is someone who is a lord of those horizons. And as our horizons expand, we recognize more and more that the Lord is really spectacular and relates to Mazda in such a way that they pair closer than one and become a shared presence. They become notes that are tuned, and when either is sounded, the other is sounded as well. So that one learns to hear profoundly. Here's the next little poem. They're called Hats, H-A-T-S, in Avestan. And from your mind and spirit the good bestowed upon the pure man's deeds, whose soul accords with Asha, in nearness to the all with you, adoring Mazda by praise songs. Asha is the feminine order of life and has a tuned quality with the good mind. Thus of you, worthy Ahura, our prayers which Asha delivers, exist is your kingdom in that good perfecting mind, fullness indeed for the wise men, always strengthened with Mazda. And the last in this initial series, this is Yazin 34. These are the first four of the poems within that set, within that group. Therefore, in your fire, Ahura, the power of Asha yearns as your everlasting blaze, continuous, dependable, clear help, and Mazda's foes at a glance are understood for their evil. This quality of instantaneity is not just a characteristic or a defining quality, but is really the quintessence of the way in which consciousness in its ecology continues to spiral out and spiral in at the same time. It's like reaching for the past in a retrospect is not the same thing as just revisiting the past, but a retrospect makes the past new. At the same time, in a supersymmetry that makes the future possible. So that the future and the new past are supersymmetry. And that the expansion now is not just Homo sapiens sapiens, but is a further refinement. And the best, simplest way to understand it is that further refinement is a distillation. Whereas the first refinement was a fermentation. You can take natural water, and through fermentation you can make wine, but through distillation you can make champagne or cognac. It's that kind of a difference. Homo sapiens became Homo sapiens sapiens through art, and we're becoming Homo sapiens stellaris, star wisdom man, through science. Our capacity for an appreciative aesthetic is now receiving the capacity to have a cosmic analytic. Not just equally, but distributively, so that the spiraling out and the spiraling in occur together tuned. This gives us a new subspecies, a refinement. And we notice right away that about 300 years ago are the beginnings of the seeds of this new refinement, this new distillation of our species, our humanity. And right there, about 350 years ago, you find Sir Isaac Newton and Benjamin Franklin. Newton, the reclusive boy, largely ignored by everybody around him when he was growing up. And his very first work was on optics, and when he would send his little things written up to the Royal Society, they were ignored because he's like this teenager. But he was no longer a teenager, he was a universal genius when finally, the age of about 44, 45, he published the Principia Mathematica, which blew out the old mathematics permanently. All of that was now passé in a sense because Newton's calculus, he called them fluxions, was able to take in a sequence between 0 and 1 or back between 1 and 0. The infinitesimal calculus worked either way, both ways, and accepted transforms without end. And it took a while in the 1700s for other men and other women to be able to utilize this. It was an extraordinary thing. Towards the pinnacle of his genius, Voltaire, who found the right lady to be with, both of them retreated to an estate not far from Geneva, and they spent years and years and years together trying to understand Newton and the Principia and how to apply it. It took a long while, and it wasn't until almost the end of the 1700s, the beginning of the 1800s, that there was finally a resurgence of comprehension that this is how to use these tools, these approaches. And you find all of a sudden, transform higher mathematics springs up almost everywhere. And one of the places where it sprang up with flaming liberty was in France. Brought together prismatically by Napoleon, who gathered not only armies, auxiliary armies of savants, so that when he wanted to reestablish a world empire, how can you have it without Egypt? So he went to Egypt with immense military power, but also equally immense genius. And the man put in charge of the scientific intellectual thing was a man named Fourier, who became one of the world's greatest mathematicians. And he's the one that edited the 20 great elephant folio volumes of the description of Egypt. And for the first time, it was appreciated. Hieroglyphics can be read, but how to read them, it took a while for Champollion to finally realize this is a poetic language. It is a sacred language because it doesn't talk about the price of bread. It talks about why bread is bread. That the hieroglyphics convey to us in a language which incorporates all of the transforms, and Fourier was all eyes and ears, so that the Fourier transform is a series that can be, and still is being refined. One of the great figures then was Galwaz. This little book, Galwaz Theory, from Springer Verlag, about 25 years ago. This text offers a clear, efficient exposition of Galwaz theory with complete proofs and exercises. Topics include cubic and quartic formulas, fundamental theorem of Galwaz theory, insolvability of the quintic, Galwaz' great theorem, solvability by radicals of a polynomial is equivalent to solubility of the Galwaz group, and apprentices on group theory, ruler compass constructions, and the early history. This book is a concise introduction. He finished his work in 1831. We are still learning how to apply these transforms, and one of the fundamental great transforms in our time is the Penrose transform. Nice little Oxford University book, The Penrose Transform and Its Interaction with Representation Theory. Representation theory comes from the Lie algebras, depending on the Galwaz group, and Homo sapiens stellaris, like John A. Wheeler, looking in retrospect, says we can make a group of muses, quantum sibyls, which can help us to appreciate that we're not floundering when we make errors. By being able to recognize those errors as errors, we can update so that it isn't the hard drive that is really essential, it's the software that is updatable that then drives the way in which the hardware expansion is utilized. It does you no good to have 160 trillion bytes per second if you don't know how to use it. Our brain now dwarfs petabytes. Our species has dwarfed it for thousands of years, and we're jumping into infinities now as Homo sapiens stellaris. The interstellar frontier to us is like the playground that's within reach from our backyard. And that's just a taste, because the intergalactic frontier is like being able to go anywhere in the sphere. Instead of just going from the backyard of your house to the playground, now you can go anywhere in the world as a traveler. We're going to be able to go anywhere in the cosmos as travelers, including time. So there has to be steps that initially seem to us as if, why is this so? To acclimate us so that we are not disheartened or despaired or discouraged because we can't get it now. You can't get it now, you just didn't know that you got it now. It takes a while to get acclimated. And Penrose's two wonderful books, The Emperor's New Mind and Shadows of the Mind. Why Shadows of the Mind? We're going to look closer next week at the way Wheeler talks about the interrelation of electrons with their holes and with the counter particle, the positron, and its hole, and the way in which, if we do not have the zeros lightly carried in the phenomenal tapestry, we do not appreciate that there's a Newman complementarity occurring really. Penrose's most recent book is 1,000 pages, The Road to Reality. As we've been looking, complementarity is a very interesting interplay. It has nothing to do with being limited by a polarizing mentality. The key wisdom document pursuant to this is the Tao Te Ching. Not written, but orally disclosed about 2,500 years ago. Lao Tan was the royal librarian in Luoyang, and he had access to all of the wisdom of China's civilization. And when he was over 100 years old, he retired. And he retired in characteristic wise old man way. Instead of passing on, he got on a water buffalo, proverbially, and rode west. And as he was riding the big yellow river, the Huanghe, has a huge arc that it turns because there are mountain cliffs, and the river has to swing out, but there's a pass that goes continuously over. It's the Hankou Pass, and on the other side of that, you drop down into the Wei River Valley, where the other capital of China, Chang'an, was, which goes all the way out to the far west, to Dunhuang, towards the Gobi Desert. So the keeper of the Hankou Pass asked Lao Tzu to deliver something for the rest of us, and so he dictated what became the Tao Te Ching, but it had no punctuation. 5,500 Chinese characters in a cascade. Later on, the way in which the chapters were made and the punctuation made was an act of choreography. It was like somebody who was a Taoist Nijinsky was able to dance it so that somebody like a Diaghilev was able to see, well, we can put this on as a production if we can get the right costumes and everything. This is my translation of a profound section of the Tao Te Ching. It's divided and becomes the traditional 42nd chapter. It's the 5-phase energy cycle. That energy, if it goes through this energy cycle unimpeded, it will not only return to the origin, Tao, but will return fertile to the origin so that it can reemerge pristinely at the very next quantum iteration, so that there is no noticeable interruption whatsoever, and instead of being a kind of a knot, it becomes a circle. But it becomes not a circularity, it becomes a circle capable of another kind of a choreography. You can expand a circle into a sphericality, so that what you had is simply a cycle before now becomes a sphericality, and you can do trigonometric functions, and all kinds of aspects emerge, so that one's visioning becomes not just 3D or even 4D, but it becomes 5D, 5-dimensional. Tao produces unity. Unity produces polarity. Polarity produces trinity. Trinity produces the 10,000 things. The 10,000 things bear yin to embrace yang. Gen, human-heartedness. Even if detested is exactly orphaned, widowed, a hermit. Kings and nobles thereby exact it for their honorific. So sometimes you lose itself and gain Sometimes you gain itself and so lose. If you do a simulacrum in your mentality, what you've gained is the simulacrum. And what was before illusory now becomes delusional. If you lose it, you lose the way in which the delusion was capable of being generated, and the illusion becomes an optical paradox. And the feeling tone that comes of being able to observe that this is paradoxical is that there is a sense of irony that occurs. And that sense of irony is in the horizon of experience that allows for the appreciation of humor. Isn't this peculiar? Isn't this funny? Isn't this laughable? And I used to be so worried about it. It was a very poor joke. Now it's a very excellent joke, and I can't wait to tell it. Gen, human-heartedness, is presence, ever taught. I also teach this presencing. The strong and aggressive ones resonate only death. Transcendence thus conveys te, founding learning. The te is the second of the 5 phases, is the oneness, is the integral. And because it is an integral, because it is the core seed root, it is the source of the way in which the whole integrality of the cycle occurs. Its oneness always ensures that if it is divided, each part of the oneness is a one. So that the te becomes a yin-yang. And the yin-yang are not a complementarity, they're a polarity of the unity. They're the way in which the te maintains its ability to give and bestow unity, in this case to the two halves, or to any fraction of it will be itself a unity. Will be able to be treated within the integral cycle. In that welter of complexity, what evaporates is the attentiveness that Tao continues to occur, not in the polarity, but in the complementarity of Tao Te. So the book is not called the Yin Yang Ching. It's called the Tao Te Ching. It is the complementarity which is fertile, but the polarity is fruitful also. Whereas the Tao makes the fertility, because fertility really comes out of the mysteriousness that you didn't just complete a cycle, but you entered into a perfectionable ecology that now spirals in and spirals out. That the transmission now, by that double chirality, includes a different scalar, a magnetoelectric scale. The magnetoelectric scale is about 20 billion times what the electromagnetic scale is. It is an energy capable of it. If you were a magnetoelectric being, you could walk through the electromagnetic cosmos and never have to touch a single nucleus or an electron, and you'd have no trouble whatsoever. If the hydrogen atom were a football field, the proton would be, and neutron would be a little pea on the 50-yard line, and the electrons would be a glint off someone's camera beyond the goalposts. Plenty of room. If you get a chance to see Buckaroo Banzai and Adventures Across the Eighth Dimension, There's a humorous little play going on in there, that there are other dimensions that are available. There are other life forms that are available. And we, like in the Renaissance, was talked about by Pico della Mirandola. Man was given the capacity to be at home anywhere on the whole core of the scalar of reality. Not assigned any particular level to which then he belonged, he was capable of participating in all of the levels, all of the scalars of dimensions. A Renaissance man or a Renaissance woman is not something way back then. Is not even the characteristic of somebody who's brilliant here, but is, as Lao Tzu puts it here in the 48th chapter, forgetting knowledge, a busy learning daily gains. A busy Tao daily diminishes. Diminishing, it again diminishes. When occurring with the not busy yet no business. To do this world eternally, this is the non-marketplace. When using that marketplace, not by definition doing the world. More next week.